Good afternoon, everybody. It's fun to see people's names coming in from all over the country, joining us for this webinar. My name is Jodi Sandfort, and I have the great privilege of being the dean here at the Evans School at UW. And this afternoon, we're going to be talking about the hidden consequences of all of the executive orders that have been coming. This is part of my Dean's Forum, and this program, we've been operating since 2021 when I began the dean, because I really know that one of the roles of public universities is to talk about the public issues and really plant seeds in the minds of people about courageous action. So we are at a really important moment to have this conversation about executive orders. There's been a tradition of the president using these tools, particularly in the first 100 days of a presidency. And in this particular case, we are not even close to 100 days, and there have been more than 100 executive orders that have been issued. So wanted to let you know that the event is being recorded. So I will be joined in a second by a couple of my panelists. And Tiffany and Ben, maybe you should come on the screen now as well. And Lauren and team, we can see all of you right now on the, at least in the view I can see. So I don't know if you want that, or I'll just keep talking. So it's going to be recorded. We'll be capturing the resources that we talk about today, and we'll share them back out with you to allow you to go deeper into some of the topics we talk about. But one of the critical things to know is a webinar is only as good as the question and answer function. And so we're going to invite you to lean in, ask questions about substantive things you would like us to talk more about. So we've really reserved a bunch of time here to be responsive to the questions from the team. So let me just do a little framing about why I wanted to call this conversation. Obviously, as I just said, we're not even 100 days in. We have more than 100 executive orders that have been issued, including one today that was just issued about the tariffs. It's important to know that executive orders don't carry the weight of Congress, and they really can be undone by any subsequent president, but they're really a way to understand the vision of a presidency. And I think it's pretty clear that the vision of this administration is to centralize authority in the office of the president. Clearly, many of those moves are being challenged in court. And there's a lot of talk in the public domain about the rule of law and whether or not the legal system and our system of laws will hold. I also wanted to have this conversation because I witness a lot of people in the whole country being in what I think of as a whack-a-mole kind of approach. So at the Evans School, like, been talking to the faculty, there's this impulse to just manage what you control and how is this impacting your organization or the issues you talk about or the issues you teach, issues you work on. We also in higher ed are really responding to unprecedented attacks on higher ed as itself and having to spend time thinking about students, international students and their visas, and the research funding that's being halted or withdrawn or delayed. We're also thinking a lot in our school about the implications of this time for what we teach students who are interested in public policy and administration. But today, I really want us to focus on things that aren't really getting the big headlines. And in my mind, these are the efforts the executive orders are having on the administrative state itself and how do we actually operate. There's clearly been stuff in the media about the attacks on federal agency, a lot about the Department of Government Efficiency, which is neither a department nor focused on efficiency, I would argue. There's been a lot about the firing of civil servants. And for us as a top public policy school, this is impacting our alumni. This is impacting our students. This is impacting the employers that engage our students. But I also think what's important to talk about today is the way the executive orders are trying to change the relationship between the federal government and state and local governments, between the federal government and nonprofit organizations, between the federal government and the way it does public good through contracts and other things. And so that's really how I'd like to scope the conversation today. So we have brought two experts who understand the operations of this administrative state. And just want to start by having Ben Brunjes, Associate Professor here at the Evans School, and Tiffany Gourley Carter, the Public Policy Director and Counsel at the National Council of Nonprofits, just start by saying, what perspective are you bringing to this conversation?
Sure. Thank you for having me today, Dean Jodi. My name's Ben Brunjes. I'm an associate professor here at the Evans School. And prior to becoming an academic, I worked in practice. I worked with the U.S. Department of Homeland Security from about 2005 to about 2013. And while I was there, I helped design and implement emergency policies in the wake of 9/11 and Hurricane Katrina. The department's job at DHS is to coordinate across different kinds of levels of government and across sectors to build national preparedness. And so I spent most of my time engaging across boundaries, working with state and local governments to help make us a safer country. From that experience, I now am an academic. I study federal government contracting and federal government grants, primarily about how we can improve partnerships across sectors to influence contractor performance, to promote social goals through federal spending, and then how having contractors in the government workforce is changing the bureaucracy itself. Recently, I served as a policy fellow at the U.S. Small Business Administration, where I helped advise on annual spending targets with small firms, study the effects of consolidation and contract bundling, which we're seeing again under this new administration. So my perspective is I'm an academic with a bit of practical experience. I'm a data guy, so if you're following me on LinkedIn, you probably know that already. And I spend most of my day thinking about these issues, how we work together within the bureaucracy across systems of federal government and federalism, and cross-sector partnership. So I'm excited to be here today and talk about the new world we live in, Jodi.
Tiffany.
Thanks for having me. It's good to be in Seattle. Well, I'm in DC, but it's good to be a part of Seattle right now. As you said, I'm the Public Policy Director and Counsel here at the National Council of Nonprofits. I've been here for about 8 years. I was hired right before the first Trump administration, and just moved back to the DC area a couple months ago. So it's a little bit of deja vu. But we like to say we work in all three branches of government, all three levels of government. So federal, state, local, legislative, executive, and judicial. We say it in that order because that's how it's put in the US Constitution. And it's easier to think of like how things play together if you think about the actual branches of government. And so, as Dean Sandfort said, there's over 100 executive orders. There's over 160 lawsuits on those executive orders. I believe there's over 70 preliminary injunctions right now on those executive orders. And we have 2 of the lawsuits. So we filed the lawsuit against the temporary pause of all federal funds. So what Professor Brunjes was just saying, which is it was about $3 trillion worth of federal funding that they tried to stop within 22 hours. We got was an administrative stay. It's now a preliminary injunction, but we got that 3 minutes before that Office of Management budget memo went into effect. But we had already seen the effects. We had already seen the negative harm that was being done to communities, to nonprofits on the ground within that 22 hours. It's a lot harder to turn money back on than it is to turn money off. And when we're talking about $3 trillion, that's a lot of pain that was caused. We saw furloughs, we saw programs shut down. Like, this is immediate. As soon as that came out, people were furloughing their employees. People were having to worry about making rent by the end of the month, making payroll, making all sorts of programmatic decisions. And so we're happy to say we have a preliminary injunction on that. Fast forward, we did see some other funding streams that weren't turned back on, namely under the Inflation Reduction Act and the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. And so we have a second lawsuit that we are asking for a preliminary injunction. The hearing is actually tomorrow in Rhode Island. So stay tuned on what happens there, but we're asking for a preliminary injunction as well. So that's kind of prior to 2025, prior to just 4 months ago, I spent most of my time in the legislative branch, even though we do all three branches. I will say most of my time has been spent in the executive branch this year, but that's not to say that there's not a lot of things happening in the other branches as well. So we're very busy, but we're happy to answer whatever questions we can and share this information. We know that, universities is a big part of the nonprofit sector, and we don't want to forget that. And we want to make sure that academia is included in these kinds of conversations, because what's happening in DC affects the entire sector. And but specific areas are targeted a little bit more, and academia being one of them.
Yeah, thanks, Tiffany. We can delve into some of that in a minute. So I was thinking that would be helpful for both of you to take a few minutes to talk more about what you can see from your vantage point of how the way the office of the president is trying to fundamentally change the role of the federal government in the country, in the world, in fact. And part of that to me is there's this rhetoric that's being used around waste, fraud, and abuse. And so I'd like you to reflect a little bit on that. And Ben, you talked about being a data guy. You want to show us a little bit of data to start?
Sure, I can do that. And I think those are really great questions and a good way to start the conversation, Jodi. A lot of what we're seeing in this new administration is new, really, really new. And some of it's not. I think it's important to spend a minute and distinguish between those things. So for example, when President Trump took office, he instituted a hiring freeze at the federal level, and he required the Office of Management and Budget to develop reports about different federal processes and different federal programs. That's normal. That's not new. We see that every time a new executive takes over. There's some other things that he's been trying to do that other presidents have also tried to do in the past. So improving the government's IT infrastructure, reducing barriers to hiring, right? These aren't strange. They're not different. And in fact, they're things that we probably do want to see changed. But there are also these other things that the new administration is doing that are very different and worth a lot of our time and attention. And when I look at what's going on, I see these new actions are doing two primary things. The first thing they're doing is they're consolidating more power in the presidency. And the second thing is accomplishing Trump's policy goals through what I might consider to be questionable executive action. So let's make sense of these by walking through three different things: Trump's rhetoric, the administration's actions, and then the implications for America and maybe for the rest of the world. So at Evans, we teach about policy change, and we often do this through the lens of framing, which we talk about as the way that political actors try to portray a policy area or a policy solution. For many years, Trump has been framing the administrative state as the deep state. People around the country have adopted that frame, and they begin to assume that the resources that we're allocating through the bureaucracy are wasteful. That is, bureaucrats are enriching themselves at the expense of the American taxpayer. So in the earliest executive orders, those on January 20th, January 21st, Trump leaned into this frame, and he asserted that federal hiring is, quote, no longer focused on merit, no longer focused on practical skill, and doesn't require dedication to the U.S. Constitution. Now, those of us who study public administration and the bureaucracy, we know this isn't true. We know that federal jobs are highly competitive. There are often hundreds and hundreds of applicants per position, and that these applications are judged on rigorous criteria. The assessment of knowledge, skills, and ability. For many of you on this call, you've filled out those applications, right? Now, to retain your job in the bureaucracy and to get promoted, you have to demonstrate practical skill. And everyone who's hired in the federal government swears an oath of office that reads, "I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States." Right? So this is all the claims that he's making here are not accurate portrayal of the system. But the frame is powerful. Still, this deep state frame is powerful, even though we know these things aren't true. And he's using it effectively to convince Americans that it's okay to ignore the due process rights that federal workers have and fire them without cause. He's justifying this by saying that principles of good administration necessitate action to restore accountability to the civil service. So when he says that, what he really means is that he wants more direct control over who is in the federal workforce, how those federal workers think, and the way that they're going to go about doing their jobs. So that is by framing federal employees in the bureaucracy as wasteful and fraudulent, Trump is convincing many people to condone this approach and to look the other way. It's a long game, many, many years in the making, and he's using it in other areas now too. Broader framing of waste, fraud, and abuse. But I would argue that I think it's unlikely that his actions are actually going to improve the quality of the federal service. They're not going to restore accountability, but they will help him accomplish his own political objectives, enable him to end programs he disagrees with, and ensure that the programs that remain are more responsive to him, the elected executive, and to his demands. And I think that his actions, if we look at those actions, bear this out. Trump claims to be attempting to lower federal spending to reduce the national debt. Though we see the disruption of this approach, right? We see terminating agencies like USAID, the Department of Education, refusing to send funds, like Tiffany mentions, to nonprofits and universities. It's all very disruptive, but is this actually saving us money? Is this doing what President Trump says it's going to do? Well, the early evidence suggests that that's not necessarily what's happening. Here you'll see a graph of spending. This is the spending chart of the US federal government over the past 4 fiscal years. The red line is the Trump administration. Despite all the chaos, all the disruptions, the federal government is still spending exactly the same amount of money that it has spent in all the previous years. Now, this doesn't mean that the job cuts and the program cuts are meaningless. They're affecting people across America. These jobs and key programs are being lost that we all rely on, and there will be ramifications for generations to come. But it does mean that the disruptions they're causing, these terminations, they're not going to have the effect that President Trump is saying. Right? That is, he's prioritizing political objectives over the actual objective that he's stating. The frame is being effective. We can see this even more closely if we look at what's actually being cut. So if you look at the data, you can see that nearly 3/4 of the savings that DOJ proclaims comes from USAID. And most of the places where we're seeing contracts cut are in agencies that are specifically Trump administration kind of enemies. They've talked about tearing them down for years. CFPB, USAID, Education, HUD, Treasury, right? So things that Trump has long spoken out against. At the same time, the agencies that Trump has supported, the Department of Defense, Energy, NASA, GSA, are not seeing those same cuts, right? DoD has only had 30 million of $1.7 trillion cut. So this isn't about reducing fraud. It's not about reducing waste or abuse. It's really about ending programs that President Trump, based on his conceptualization of the deep state and what it is, might see as wasteful. So then what does it mean for us moving forward? Well, I think there are 3 really important things. The first thing is that for administrative organizations, as this executive power consolidates, you'll be under more direct control of that executive, and there will be more control for the president through the levels of bureaucracy, from the federal government down into state and local governments and out into the nonprofit and private sectors. Even though Trump says that he's going to promote more state autonomy, I think there'll be fewer federal dollars to spend and the ever-looming possibility of kind of political reprisal if states don't do what Trump wants. He's going to use federal grant dollars, federal contracts as a way to make other levels of government do the things that he wants them to do. And then finally, I think it's worth noting before I end here that this has largely been made possible through what we have talked about as collaborative governance or privatization, right? By going out and diversifying those revenue streams to make our organizations more resilient, which is how we've been talking about it for years. What's actually happened is that many state and local governments, along with private sector organizations, have become dependent on the federal government. And because we're dependent on the federal government, we expect some sort of mutual reciprocity, mutuality, system of norms where we all kind of march in the same direction. But that only works if the institutions are stable and if the players at the table agree to those norms, the players at the table agree that there's a reciprocal relationship between us. It seems clear right now that that's no longer the case. So Dean Jodi, when you ask me what waste, fraud, and abuse mean, I think it depends on where you sit and the frames that you've adopted. For many of us, I think that along with the words like efficiency, these mean different things in the way the Trump administration is implementing them, which in this case is to make their preferred policy changes, which will, from my perspective, lead to probably more abuse and fraud as executive authority expands.
Thank you, Ben. Very, very helpful. Tiffany, want to take you back to those questions. So you started to talk a little bit about what you've been learning with the injunctions, but what can you really see from the vantage point you have about the way these actions are trying to change the federal government's role in the country, and then this use of the waste, fraud, and abuse rhetoric as part of that agenda.
Yeah, it's interesting. This is the first, I've been doing a lot of these calls, and this is the first time I've been asked about waste, fraud, and abuse specifically, which is an interesting approach to it, right? Waste, fraud, and abuse is all through the federal code. It's all through statute as things that you are not, the federal government is supposed to be actively reducing, right? Historically, this isn't new. That is something that has been in statute for a very long time. So much so that every single agency has an inspector general to bring out and to investigate waste, fraud, and abuse. The first thing, one of the very first things President Trump does is remove all of the inspectors general from all of those agencies, which is a very, interesting way to reframe and restructure the federal government whenever they were already doing that. So and then just completely, put it to the side. Then, to your point, bringing in the Department of Government Efficiency, which was not a government, which is not the department. It is not government. It was originally run by two men, which you would say isn't efficient if they have two people running the same job. One of them has left. Now they renamed another government agency to be that now. So they're just changing things around. The whole approach is very different, right? To Ben's point, which I completely agree, which is consolidating power and restructuring things through, especially government grants and contracts, which is kind of the vantage point that we're sitting through. And claiming that if you get any federal funds, this is something that the rhetoric coming out of the administration is, which is nonprofits, if you get federal funds, we can treat you as government and we should be able to control you. That is just because nonprofits receive federal funds, we are partners with government. We fill a need in our communities. The nonprofit people on this call, you fill a need in your community. You exist because you see a need in your community. That wouldn't be said about for-profits, right? There are trillions of dollars of for-profit government funding, federal funding that goes to for-profits. Think roads, think security. That happens every day. And no one would say, oh, but this for-profit, you get federal funds, so you should be treated the same as government. It's just nonprofits that are being used as that kind of, I don't know, talking point, I guess. The other thing that we're seeing is, yes, there is often a review of, where this funding's going through. Nonprofits are the most transparent sector in the country, with the reporting that we have to do on every single level, every single grant, every single contract. All of our taxes are completely public. You can just look them up online. People see, your employment records, the costs, the payroll, like that's all public. Not the same in the for-profit sector, right? But where I was going with this was that, yes, you can review these things. You can't just go and start cutting things, freezing things, stopping things, and claiming that that makes it more efficient, or makes that is claiming that that is stopping fraud and abuse. You can't do it, as we're arguing, in an arbitrary and capricious way, which is against the law, right? You have to be more systematic than that. Our judge in our first case said, it would take more than a day to review any single contract or any single grant coming out of the government, let alone trillions of dollars worth, to do within 22 hours. Like, it just doesn't make sense. And so where we see this is between, grants and contracts, but then you're getting into like the bigger question of the rule of law. You're getting into the bigger questions of the separation of powers. You're getting into the bigger question of like the ability for the executive branch to be, how powerful it is compared to the legislative branch, compared to the judicial branch, and then the interactions between all of them. And I think we're going to get into this later, so I don't want to spend too much time on it in this answer, but those issues and that vantage point really matters, right? Whenever you're deciding how much control any branch should have. And I think what the administration is doing, and doing pretty well, is systematically taking away those levers to consolidate consolidate power. And what we're seeing in the nonprofit sector is especially in relations to the partnerships that we have with government at all levels of government.
Tiffany, it's something I actually wanted to ask you because I think your association works with state level associations that are networks of independent organizations that have their own boards of directors. And so, as Ben had mentioned, part of the change in our country in the last 50 years has been the reliance by all levels of government with the nonprofit and the for-profit sector, but nonprofits in particular. We have a whole literature about partnerships in public service. So I'm curious about how that network structure has been a strength or a liability for you in the last, oh my God, it feels like 5 years, but 2 months, as we have been trying to understand and make sense of the implications of this pretty fundamental alteration in the role that the federal government will play in that, what has been a partnership over time.
Yeah, that's a great question. So we have state associations across the country. We have one in Washington. We have, I think, about 54 state associations in about 48 states. We have a couple doubles. That's why the math doesn't add up. And unlike Ben, I am not a math person. I went to law school to avoid math. But the strength of that is our network of networks. And so all of their members are our members. If you're a member of your state association, you're a member of ours. Thank you for that. We greatly appreciate it. What this means is we are able to put out information as quickly as possible, and we're able to receive information back. So we put out a form, we put out surveys, we're asking, how is this affecting you? We actually had a survey before the funding freeze saying, what are these administrative actions, these executive actions doing to your organizations on the ground? And we were getting tons of responses immediately, which we were able to then share out with policymakers, we were able to share out with partners, we were able to share with members of Congress. Whenever the funding freeze happened, we were able to pull those stories immediately, and that's how we were able to find plaintiffs for this case. And we're still doing that. We're still updating it because information is coming really, really fast and things are changing so quickly. So I would say that the structure of our network has been instrumental in our ability to respond to what's happening. And the beauty of it is we're actually able to say you're not alone. There are people across the country who are also experiencing this, and we're able to connect you. We like to say we champion, connect, and inform the nonprofit sector. Champion is, as I mentioned, all 3 branches of government, all 3 levels of government, but we're connecting the sector to see the trends that are happening, not just in policy and not in public policy, also in operations, also in finances and fundraising. And that's how we are able to consolidate the information and pass it back out so quickly through our various communication channel, which is our inform section. So please sign up for our newsletter. If you aren't, shameless plug, we have a free newsletter that goes out every other week. Next one will be out on Monday. And we also do like calls to action in there and try to coordinate, messaging in those types of opportunities.
We'll put the newsletter link in the resources for this. Thanks very much. Wow, I'm listening as we talk about the characteristics of resiliency during this time, so I'll kind of shape that at the end. One of the things I am wondering about your opinion on is, as I've been reading these executive orders closely, I think that in addition to the points you've both made, it really is trying to under the fog, using the metaphor for this session, change the values that the federal government reinforces. And when I dug in, I really feel like fundamentally there is an effort to undo the legacy that goes way back to the Kennedy and the Johnson administrations, where there were really hard fought wins from the civil rights era that were embedded, that were trying to use the administrative state to promote social equity. And we all know that that vision wasn't achieved. But, the civil rights laws were envisioned. There was not, everything wasn't realized, but because we know institutions are slow to change, there were things that were altered then that now are being changed. So some of the things, Ben, I know you've done research on is prioritization to historically underrepresented groups in government contracts. This whole politicization of the diversity, equity, inclusion orientation, which is really an effort to try to align the administrative state in its operations with public values. I mean, if you think about what is the opposite of diversity, it's uniformity. What's the opposite of equity? It's inequity. What's the opposite of inclusion? It's marginalization and exclusion. So now that we've weaponized something that is supposed to be around diversity, equity, and inclusion, and presumably then say we want to have an administrative state that's focused on uniformity, inequity, and marginalization. So I guess what are the larger goals that you think might be being perceived here in how the machinery of the federal government is being altered? And it's hard because all of the rhetoric in the executive orders, I mean, it feels very Orwellian to me. 1984, I'm a child of public schools in the 70s and 80s when we had to read that book, but where the language being used is not at all the language of reality. So I'm just curious, reactions either of you have to those reflections.
So I agree. I think what we have been seeing is an attempt to redefine what is anti-discrimination. What can, even in the executive orders, they were repealing executive orders from President Johnson in the 60s, and repealing requirements to have anti-discrimination clauses in government grants and contracts, and referencing the Civil Rights Act, but in a backwards way. And I see this as back to your question originally, which is, this control, this ability to redefine what the executive branch can and cannot control, and they're controlling the definitions of what is discrimination and what more specifically is anti-discrimination. The problem is that they aren't then defining it clearly so that you know where they're going with it. So in the executive orders, they mentioned diversity, equity, inclusion. They actually mentioned specifically illegal diversity, equity, and inclusion, but we don't know what illegal is. They don't define diversity, equity, and inclusion. There was a court case against that. Maryland, a district court in Maryland said that your use of diversity, equity, inclusion as it pertains to these executive orders could be found unconstitutional and vague. The Fourth Circuit overturned that, and so now they're moving forward, and hopefully the courts will actually define this. But that was all by design, right? It was purposeful that they didn't actually describe it, that they didn't define it, that they didn't give examples of it, because they're just kind of, to Ben's point, attacking the rhetoric versus going to the actual step of explaining what they want out of it. So I see it as their attempt to redefine law, redefine language, redefine definitions, and to some degree redefine history.
Yes.
Yeah, I'd just add a little on there and say that from a values perspective, it's a value shift, right? And the verbiage they're using, they're saying that they're moving maybe towards equality instead of equity. So the language is a government committed to serving every person with equal dignity and respect. That's from a January 20th executive order. Problem is with this kind of equality approach that we really can't treat everyone exactly the same way, even when it comes to something as simple as opportunity, which is always the kind of the talking point. We all want people to have equal opportunity. So example here, even if we use vouchers to allow students to pick the schools they go to so that they all can go to the exact school that they want, those vouchers don't change student home lives. They don't change what's going on outside of school, which affects how they perform in the classroom. There are many other places where kind of like this equality problem arises, right? So how do we treat breast or prostate cancer in an equal society? How do we treat sickle cell anemia, mesothelioma, where depending on your job, you may be more likely to get it, right? So we all are kind of, not all of us, but most of us have some way where we're not equal to everyone else. And in this society, we can see it. We can see that we're different. We can see the visible differences, the systemic differences between us. And so, Jodi, that was the promise of the Great Society programs, was that equity was the bridge to kind of try to make things more equal given those natural disparities in the world. And so, I mean, my thought about this is that we're using EEO language to undermine EEO in a way that will demolish these programs and kind of not just end the Great Society programs, but take us back to a place where we're unable to function from a policy perspective.
Ben, do you want to talk a little bit about what your data can show you about the changes in the contracting to historically underrepresented groups?
Yeah. So one of the things that when I've been talking about this is I note that these things aren't felt equally across society. Different groups of people are experiencing grant terminations and contract terminations and workplace terminations differently. And so I think one of the more powerful examples is we all know that diversity, equity, and inclusion contracts have been terminated in the federal government a lot over the last few months. And so here's some early data that shows what that looks like. Who has those diversity, equity, and inclusion contracts? So this is from about the first month of the Trump administration. You can see no diversity, equity, and inclusion contracts were terminated during the Biden administration. And then beginning with Trump, the blue line is the total number of diversity, equity, inclusion contracts that were terminated. And the red line is the proportion of them that went to small, disadvantaged businesses. So that's businesses owned by women, businesses owned by minorities, business owned by service-disabled veterans. And it tracks almost perfectly, right? So that is, who were we hiring to give diversity, equity, inclusion related service to the federal government? Small firms that have been excluded from government halls to begin with. So by implementing these executive orders, the government is essentially excluding the people that these programs were designed to essentially allow access to halls of power and help us change the way we think about the world.
There's a lot of real people and a lot of real jobs and a lot of real programs that are underneath each one of those dots and those lines, but I appreciate seeing that macro view. Tiffany, is there anything you know about that topic in particular?
About, sorry, the undisturbed, like the women and Black and brown communities being harmed disproportionately. Well, I mean, we're seeing that, right? I think that's just, I don't know if I have more to add from what Ben was just saying, but it is a disproportional impact, especially, and also in like rural communities. Small towns are getting hit very hard in this as well. And it's an interesting take on claiming that they're trying to remove diversity, equity, inclusion, but then they're harming the groups that would be benefiting from it most of all. So I don't know if I have much more to add than that, but I do agree with these findings.
I'd say that nonprofits are also in that group. So if you look at the data, nonprofits are, compared to what they received when Biden took office, they received only 20% of the grants under the Trump administration that they received over that same period during the Biden administration. So it's social service organizations and organizations owned by groups that have long been excluded.
I think there is a point to be made though that about the different groups that are also being targeted. You know, we often think of social services, the social safety net is what people talk about. But these executive orders, they're across the board, right? So there's attacks on libraries, museums, the Smithsonian. There just today I was on a call and they're talking about, you know, reduction in from the National Endowment of the Arts and National Endowment of the Humanities. The research funding is a really big NIH funding. So it's and I would say the communities that benefit the most from those groups are the, you know, Black and brown and women-led communities. So it's everyone is harmed, I think is the.
So as we're painting this picture, one of the things that I want to make sure we really focus in on is, what are we thinking? Where do we think this path is going to go? right now people talk a lot about citizens don't trust institutions, and yet when I see what is mediating this attempt to centralize power in an executive branch, which is very not been the history of our country, it is the institutions. It's the legal system, the judiciary system, and how that's operating, and concern that Congress is in fact not been calling to adjust this executive power. But there's also the federalist system, right? And the fact that we're talking now about the federal government, and that state and local governments have their own roles. Ben, you talked about public education. And one of the things that was really clear to me in those first executive orders is that by design, our educational system has been based at local control. Local school boards have the authority to make curricular decisions, investment decisions, and the federal government's role historically has been to address inequities, right? This is a move actually to centralize control of the educational system and promote things that are trying to destabilize public education with the encouragement of vouchers, not only coming from the Department of Education, but coming from other branches of government that have smaller pots of money that now are directed to invest in choice-based mechanisms for public education. So I'm curious about your own reflections about federalism at this time, and if you have worries like I do about the ways that some of these moves are trying to take aim at some of the parts of the federal system that historically have been more focused on state and local control.
So for me, and I'll try not to be too academic here, but I think that we're likely to see pretty uneven effects across the country. And that's because, again, I don't think that this is because Trump actually wants to influence education policy that much, or actually change things to make them better. It's that he wants control. The administration wants control. And so you'll see investigations, for example, at the University of Washington, at American University, but you won't see them in Idaho and you won't see them in Texas, places where they've also been running diversity, equity, inclusion programs at the University of Idaho and the University of Texas. So I think that because his political priorities are control, there will be some devolution rhetoric. That is, we're going to try to give more power to the states, but the implementation today will vary greatly from state to state. There will be some alliances with states that Trump agrees with generally, and there will be alienation in states where he doesn't agree with. So I think that maybe the model that we're thinking of might be called contentious federalism. I was trying to think about all the different models of federalism we have. One of the most common is a marble cake model, where we think about it all kind of mixing together, and that's kind of how we've thought about federalism for a while. What I expect will happen is that the bubbles will only go down. There won't be bubbles coming back up from the bottom to the top of this cake. We'll see a lot of federal colored bubbles making their way down into the state and local levels of government. And my example of this right now is state level Doge. So many states around the country are adopting their own versions of Doge to be consistent with what the president would like to see states do. And so I think that we'll probably see that contentious federalism between the liberal states, and moments where the federal government uses its increasingly consolidated executive power to push its priorities down through bubbles into the lower levels of government.
I have so many questions about the state Doge. I've never heard of this. And I'm looking at time and seeing the great questions that are coming in. So I'm not going to go there. Tiffany, you want to say anything about federalism before we turn to some questions that are coming in?
I agree. I really like the cake metaphor. I'm going to start using that then. I will give you credit for it. But I think from a nonprofit, a local nonprofit stance, right? I think the answer is collective action, working together, building coalitions. The question, what I keep getting asked is this question of, with everything going on at the federal level, what are the states and locals doing? And what we keep saying is the state and locals, they're just going to keep getting more pressure on them, right? And if you take away nonprofits, then there's going to be exponential pressure on state and locals to fill this need, to fill these gaps. Because if you take away nonprofits, the needs are still there. They still exist. And now all of a sudden you're looking at things that nonprofits are more efficient and better at filling than local governments and state governments. And so I think it's the opposite mindset of like why nonprofits are so important right now. And if you are putting on if you're taking away state and locals' abilities to act, or if you're putting more pressure, if you're consolidating pressure through or control through federalism, then you're putting more pressure at a state and local level that the state and local governments just can't handle. So I agree. I do like the term contentious federalism. I think it's a accurate foreshadowing.
Tiffany, to just out Ben, the cake metaphor is something that a guy wrote about in 1950 something. He's just been.
Oh,
I'm not that smart.
I didn't know that. I don't care. We're still gonna give Ben the credit. That's fine.
I love it. So there've been a lot of great questions coming in, so I'm going to dig into some of them. So some questions about, with this kind of approach to the administrative state changing, do you think that the current administration is going to try to fill the need of services by going and depending more on private firm contracts? And if so, how do you think that will impact services that actually aren't profit making, right? Things that are distributing benefits to veterans or other kinds of things. Like, how do you think this private motivation that is really, for example, driven some of the reforms in prisons, right, where private firms are making money off of public prisons, how is that going to play out? Either of you have a crystal ball about that?
Well, as someone who studies privatization, I think that it's probably likely that we'll see increased privatization under the Trump administration. The first time around, Trump's method of improving efficiency through contracting was what was called contract bundling. So he took many small contracts and bundled them together into bigger contracts, which means you have to go to the market fewer times. And so that means also that only bigger firms can win. So we'll see more contracting out, larger contracts with empowered big firms. And essentially through that mechanism and sort of centralization within GSA, that's another way that the central presidential executive office will exert greater control over what government is doing. There'll be bigger contracts that the president can see. They'll be centralized under GSA, which the president will have direct control over.
Just say more what GSA is.
The General Services Administration. It's the kind of like the place where they do routine tasks within the federal government. They're going to move all contract management into this office. So in some ways that sounds good, right? It's going to cost us maybe less as we go out to the marketplace, but it also facilitates patronage. It also facilitates the idea of rewarding political allies through the allocation of contracts. So if I were to guess, I'd say that the likelihood of corruption and kleptocracy will go up. And the chances of a hollower state that has a lower ability to oversee those contracts will also increase as we fire and get rid of federal employees. So yes, I think that we'll see increased privatization with many different, not many different, with a kind of like an oligarchical class of contracts winning. And in terms of quality, there will be places where it'll improve and places where it will get worse, but I would expect that particularly for things where money can't be made effectively, that the quality may go down.
And I think those people will lose services. The people who need the services that you don't make money off of are the ones that will ultimately fall through the cracks.
I agree. And you're right. It won't just be quality will go down. Some of those programs will disappear completely.
So people listening to our conversation are they're thinking about, okay, strategy, right? So my objective on this is to plant seeds for action. And so somebody said something beautiful that or they said it beautifully, so I'm just going to read it. Seeing that both law and logic are being weaponized by this administration, what are your ideas about strategic ways that people could take action in this approach to reform?
I think this goes back to what I was saying about collective action. Like, I think you need to build coalitions, build partnerships, have a singular voice on the things you can have singular voices on. Like, I'm not saying everyone's going to agree on everything because you won't, but the things that you can focus on, the reforms that you really need to highlight, the prioritizations for your communities. We try to bring it back down to communities every time. That's where I think things can actually change. The fastest way to ruin a plan is for 5 different voices to be saying 5 different things that none of them align. But if you can all come with the same plan, come up with like, this is what we need for our communities, and it's different for every community, right? Whether it's like a community in Seattle or a community in Eastern Washington, you probably have different needs. But if you can work together to say, this is what we need, this is where we need to go, and this is how we need to push back on whatever it might be, making sure we get the grants and contracts to our communities. I think that's where the change actually happens and where responses can rise.
The question I've been wrestling with, Jodi, because it's not moments, it's every day that I feel like something's happening that is it's so unbelievable that I don't know what to do. I'm overwhelmed by the things that are going on around me. And so I've tried to do a few things. And the first one is I've tried to lean into the things that I'm good at, lean into the things that I can actually control, right? So I know data and I know the academic literature. And so I'm like out there doing the things that I can with data and the academic literature to try to make the case for whatever it is I can do, because that's what I know best. So I want to encourage you all to figure out whatever it is you control, what your power is, and use those things. Like, what do you have control over? If it's your nonprofit, make sure your nonprofit survives. Figure out how to make that last, because it's important. If it's something else, if it's smaller, if it's larger, use the power, use the control that you have. And the other thing is, and this is the hardest thing, you can't look away. You can't stop thinking about it. And I think that that's really hard for so many people right now, is that we want to not think about it. But that's part of what they're trying to do, is to get you to look away, to not notice what's going on. And so this is not like how we save an organization, but it's how we save our country. We can't look away in these moments and ignore what's happening.
Yes. Yes. I have a few tactical questions, Tiffany, for you. Do you think it's worth applying for federal grants? Does it make sense to try to scrape out the trigger words? And people here, I think, are struggling because the federal executive order is directly in contrast to state law on things, for example, here in gender affirming care. So is it in Ben's, great entreaties of like how to act, if you're in a nonprofit, what's your advice about that?
Yeah, I mean, yes, I think it is still worth it to be applying for grants and contracts, especially if that's what, you rely on, those partnerships and earning that money with those partnerships. I have heard things where their applications are being sent back because of 1 word or 2 words, and if you need to change them a little bit to make sure that your mission, don't lose your mission, right? Don't lose your values. Be more specific on who you serve. I keep telling, like, be as specific as you can. We actually serve these people in this community doing this work. Don't be fluffy in things. Don't say like, oh, we do diversity, we do diverse groups or something. Like, talk about the communities that you actually serve. I have also, I believe today, some federal earmarks have just opened up for application for congressionally directed spending. I don't know about specifically Washington members of Congress, but I believe there was a notice that went out today. So like that's worth it. This is a bigger, like, I have a bigger grants and contracting issue. We've been talking about this for years. We think that there needs to be grants and contracting reform, not by just like cutting it all off, but actually, clearly making some good streamlining reforms. So put the effort into figuring out if this is worth your time. But if it's something that you've always done, then I would say yes, I think it's still worth it. Maybe put more time into reading the provisions and the little, the fine print, and if you can push back on some of the fine print, maybe do it. I think the bigger question right now is the question of, are there people to be actually servicing the grants and reviewing the grants and approving the grants. And that's a question right now. So things are a little bit slower. I will say, be a little bit more patient with timing.
I will also say that if people suddenly don't apply for grants that they are uniquely qualified to do, the consolidation that Ben is talking about will be justifiable because the alternative suppliers won't even be in the marketplace.
And I'll say that if you don't apply for those grants, someone will. And will they be as good as you?
Right. One question that somebody asked is about kind of hope. So in wanting us to weigh in on, is this an issue just for the next 3 years, or these permanent issues? And how far in the future, right, do we project that we're going to be dealing with this? I mean, in part, I'll just say I wanted to have this conversation with you because I feel like the things we're talking about today, if people don't know about them, these are going to be changes that will affect us for decades to come. And we need to share information, be mobilized, and understand the larger ideology about power and state that are underpinning this. So I don't think any of us know, is this the next 3 years, next 2 years, right? Or permanent. But I feel certain, just as Ben said, if we don't engage at this level, they will become permanent, and it will be a fundamental reorientation of the administrative state. So to me, the hope is all the smart people that I know who are working on these issues, that as long as people are paying attention and building the kinds of coalitions, the unconventional coalitions, I think that Tiffany was talking about, and coordinate our action, that is when we will be able to evolve and innovate during this time of excessive change. But what are the others of you? Where do you find the hope?
I agree. I think there is opportunity here, right? If they are trying to make things more efficient, there is opportunity to actually be more efficient. But they can't hear about it unless you tell them, right? Minds don't change when we don't engage. One of my dear friends here, who's a fantastic advocate, said that to me once, and it's true. So you need to speak up. And I mean, we encourage you to call your members of Congress and talk about the impact that you're having in your communities and the impact that their decisions have on you. And if you are able to build those relationships and build that line of communication, you might be able to then affect the change that you want to see, not just from a like negative or stopping, stopping negative action, but from actually like pushing positive change.
We've done diversity, equity, and inclusion work over the last 40 to 50 years because it is efficient, because it makes real differences in the lives of people in ways that we have demonstrated over and over and over again. So, I want you all to remember that. Like, this is not, it is a huge change. And I think that Tiffany's point earlier about how it's easier to tear things down to stop funding than it is to restart the funding. I don't think we can overstate how big these changes already are. Like, these are huge changes that are going to stick with us for a long time. But that doesn't mean that we can't continue to do really important and good work, because we know it's important, we know it's good, we know it's efficient. It fits into the rhetoric that they're using. So that's how I keep hope. The changes are happening, but we can still do good work even in this system.
With that, unbelievably, we are basically at time, and I'm sorry for those who attended that I couldn't get your questions. There were so many questions happening in the chat. But I'm just really grateful that you both were able to join me and this wonderful group of humans that are with us virtually. We will, as I said earlier, be sending you this recording. Please share it with people that you know in your professional and personal lives that could benefit from hearing it. We'll also be gathering some of the resources you've provided, as well as things that Ben and Tiffany have suggested. So again, sharing information is one of the ways that we are resilient with each other, and figuring out, as Ben said, what can you do? What are you good at? And how do you want to lean into helping us create the democracy we need rather than the one that we've had is really important at these times. So thanks. Hopefully this was a shot in your arm in the hump day of the week. But there's really important issues for us to be talking about. So thanks all.